Hey, this is John Mitchell. I preach for the Calhoun Church of Christ here in Calhoun, Georgia. I want to encourage you to visit us on our website at calhounchurchofchrist.com. That's calhounchurchofchrist.com. You will be able to find a lot more biblical content. Also, check us out on YouTube and Vimeo. Make sure you subscribe, and you'll be able to get a lot more videos like this one. This is one of my favorite times of the month. It is Bible Q&A time. This will be the last question and answer session that we have for 2020, and we have some really good questions that have been submitted for this month. A lot of them are pretty deep. It took me all day basically to look up the biblical answers to these, so we're going to go ahead and get right into it. So let's go ahead and start, and I'm going to see if I can pull this up here and get going on our first question. All right. Question number 1. Is Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 through 12, talking about a married couple? Is Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 through 12, talking about a married couple? All right, let's dive into that and let's see what the passage is talking about. If you have your Bibles with you, open it up to Ecclesiastes chapter 4, and we're going to examine the context of verses 9 through 12 first off. Remember, if you want to know what any particular passage in the Bible is talking about, it is always good first and foremost to examine the immediate context. And once you've examined the immediate context, then do some study, do some research, and see what the rest of the Bible has to say about that topic, and you'll have a really good idea of what you need to know. So in the immediate context of Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 through 12, what we see here is that Solomon's actually talking about the work that a person does with his hands. Go up to verse 4, Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 4, and let's read verses 4 through 8. These are the verses right before the passage in question. We're going to read verses 4 through 8 of Ecclesiastes 4. Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after wind. Again I saw vanity under the sun, one person who has no other, either son or brother. Yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business. So, in the context, Solomon here is talking about the work a person does with his hands. Look again at verse 4. What the point that Solomon's making in verse 4 is that when someone is good at their job, it can cause others to be jealous of them. And look at verses 5 and 6 again. Verses 5 and 6, what Solomon's pointing out here is that being lazy is pretty foolish. And he also points out that it's better to be basically relatively poor and be quietly content than to work and work and work and work too much so that you can acquire lots of wealth, and that wealth that you acquire will not satisfy you in the end. His overall point here is found in verses 4 and 6, which is that all this work and all this hardship that you go through to acquire all this wealth, ultimately it's vanity and striving after wind. And then we get to verses 7 and 8. In verses 7 and 8, the point that he's making is it is especially meaningless, it's especially vanity and striving after wind if you're alone. And if you're alone and therefore you have no one to care for, you have no family to look after, then you're not really motivated that much to work that hard. So he's talking about working hard while being alone when he brings up the passage that is under question here. So let's read verses 9 through 12 now. He says then, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? Though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. So basically what Solomon is saying here is it is better to have companions. It is better to have someone that you are friends with, someone that you care for while you work at your job, because those friends, those companions, they can help you as you work together. If one of you falls, or if one of you is opposed in some way at work, then having those friends and having those companions to back you up and help you, that is a good thing. Now the question is this passage talking about marriage? Well, it could be, but kind of in an indirect way. When we examine the context, we see that Solomon's actually talking about work. Now he does bring out in verses 7 through 8 that it's very hard, and there's lots of meaninglessness to when you work alone and you don't have, as verse 8 brings out, either a son or a brother, which would imply family, for you to work for you to have you as a companion, to have your back when you're working, to support you. I would say that if you look at verses 9 through 12, there are principles that are laid out in these verses. Now again, these verses are talking about contextually the value of having friends and companions in the workplace, but there are principles that are laid out here that do apply to marriage. For example, the reason marriage exists in the first place is because way back with Adam and Eve, God saw when Adam was alone, he said, "It is not good for the man that he should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him." Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, and then he made Eve out of Adam's rib. And so the marriage relationship, that very first marriage of Adam and Eve, it came about because God saw what Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 9 is saying, that two is better than one. Here's something else too. We know that the Bible teaches that the husband and the wife are to love each other. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25, the husband is to love his wife as Christ loves the church. In Titus chapter 2, verse 4, older women are to teach the younger women to love their husbands. So what does it mean to love biblically? Well, biblical love requires that you support one another for better or for worse, in good times, but also in times of hardship, which is something else that's brought out in the Ecclesiastes passage when Solomon says in verse 11 that if, or not in verse 11, but in verse 10, but if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. Here's something else that comes to mind about marriage as well. The Bible brings out in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4, that the marriage bed is undefiled. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, we read that one of the purposes behind marriage is to avoid fornication, and that the husband and the wife are to basically have a very happy and active and fulfilling sex life in their marriage bed, and they're not to withhold intimacy from each other. And so that brings to mind what Solomon's talking about in verse 11. If two lie together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? Something else that the Bible brings out about marriage, in Matthew chapter 19, verse 6, Jesus said that in marriage, God is the one who joins husband and wife together. So God would basically be the third party in a marriage. And that reminds me of what Solomon says in verse 12, that a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So basically, to sum up, Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 through 12, when you examine it in its context, it's not necessarily talking about married couples so much as it is talking about the ultimate vanity of a man working and being alone. However, the principles that are laid out in the passage very much can apply to married couples in an indirect way. So let's move on to the next question. The next question is very, very relevant to the times in which we're living right now. Here is the next question. Romans 13 says to submit to the governing authorities. What if the governing authorities are corrupt and evil? Are there any situations in which a Christian does not have to submit to governing authorities? Again, considering that this question was submitted right after the 2020 election, that is a very, very relevant question. There are 3 passages in the New Testament that command Christians to submit to governing authorities and also to honor governing authorities. And I'd like to read all 3 of them at this time. If you have your Bibles, open them to Romans chapter 13, and we're going to read the first 7 verses. Romans 13, verses 1 through 7. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Now let's go to the next passage. Go to 1 Peter chapter 2, and we're going to start with verse 13 and read through verse 17. That's 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you shall put to death, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. And then let's go to the next passage. Go to Titus chapter 3, and let's read verses 1 and 2. Titus chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, and to show perfect courtesy toward all people. So, here's what I want to talk about when it comes to these 3 passages. Again, those passages, if you're taking notes, Romans 13, verses 1 through 7, 1 Peter 2, verses 13 through 17, and Titus chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Historically, all of these passages were written while Nero was emperor of Rome. Now, Nero, historically speaking, was a tyrant. He was an extremely immoral pagan, and the thing that he is best known for is, number 1, setting Rome on fire, number 2, persecuting Christians. In fact, it was Nero who ordered the deaths of both Paul and Peter. And Paul and Peter are the same apostles who wrote these passages we just read, the passages that say to submit to and honor the emperor and other rulers. In fact, it is said of Nero that he was so depraved that he would light Christians on fire while they were still alive, and the only reason he did it was to provide light for him to see his garden at night. Now, there were other rulers who were in power around the time that Paul and Peter were inspired to write these passages. Not long, just about a decade or so before Paul wrote this, you had Pilate. Pilate was governor of Judea, and Pilate was the governor who ordered Jesus' death even though he knew that Jesus was innocent. And then you also have the Jewish ruling authorities, the Jewish council. They're the ones that tried Jesus illegally. It was an illegal trial. They found him guilty of wrongs that he did not commit. Later, these same Jewish ruling authorities would persecute and order the deaths of many of the disciples in the early church. I'm also reminded of Felix. Felix was in power around this same time. He was the governor who held Paul in prison for 2 years, even though Paul was innocent of the charges, And the reason he held Paul in prison was because he was hoping for a bribe. So, in spite of the fact that these evil and corrupt men were in power at the time, God still inspired Paul and Peter to command Christians to be in subjection. Now, that word in subjection is used in Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, and in Titus 3. It comes from a Greek word that literally means to rank under, to subject oneself, to obey, to be subject, to subordinate, to submit to one's control. And they all wrote that Christians are to be in subjection. They are to submit to the governing authorities. Romans 13, verse 1, Titus 13, verse 1, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13. Here's something else. If you go back to Romans 13 and you look at verses 1 and 2, you'll see that we saw that the governing authorities, Paul said they were instituted by God. He says that those who resist them, verse 5, verse 2, that those who resist them resist what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Verse 5 brings out that they will also incur the wrath of God. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 and 14, Peter said the same thing. He commanded Christians to be subject to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him. And he said, be subject for the Lord's sake. In verse 15, he called it the will of God. So here's the question. In fact, it is the question that was submitted. Are there any situations in which a Christian does not have to submit to governing authority? So are there any exceptions to this? Yes, there are. The New Testament shows only one exception. Go to Acts chapter 5 and look at verse 28. In Acts chapter 5, verse 28, you'll see that the Jewish authorities, back in chapter 4, verse 18, they had specifically told the apostles, they had specifically commanded the apostles, we strictly charge you not to teach in Jesus' name. And when the apostles did it anyway, and they were arrested again and brought before the council in Acts 5, verse 28, they said, we had told you, we had strictly charged you not to teach in his name. And what did Peter and the apostles reply? Look at verse 29. Acts 5, verse 29. Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. You see, God had already told them, Jesus had told them, Matthew 28, verse 19, go and make disciples of all nations. Mark chapter 16, verse 15, go and preach the gospel to the whole world, to every creature. And so, God had already told them what to do. The Jewish authorities were telling them to do something that God had told them to do. The Jewish authorities were telling them to do something to not do something that God had specifically told them to do. And so they decided to obey God rather than man. So from this, what we can gather is that if a governing authority specifically commands you or me as Christians to do something or to not do something that is in direct opposition to what God has commanded of us in the Bible, then we are not under any obligation to obey that ruling authority. But here's what Acts 5:29 does not say. It does not give us license to disobey the ruling authority because of that ruler's personal unrighteousness. If that ruler happens to be a very evil person, Acts 5:29 does not give us a license to just go ahead and disobey anything that ruler tells us to do simply because they're an evil person. If we dislike the policies of that ruler, and those policies, they may be wrong, they may not be wrong, but those policies do not directly require that we as Christians personally sin, then Acts 5:29 does not apply. We can't use Acts 5:29 as justification to not obey or not be in subjection to that governing authority. Because in Acts 5:29, Peter and the apostles were directly told personally to not evangelize. Jesus told them to evangelize. They had a choice to make. They chose to follow Jesus, the right choice. But just because a governing authority of today might have a policy, a tax policy, a foreign policy, a policy that has to do with social matters, and we happen to not like it, but that policy does not demand personally of us that we personally disobey God, then Acts 5:29 does not apply in a situation like that. Here's something else that we must note about Acts 5:29. Peter and the other apostles, when they said we must obey God rather than man, notice that in that passage and in the entire New Testament, they did not call for revolution. They did not call for secession against the Jewish ruling authorities after the Jewish ruling authorities had given them that sinful command. All they did was simply choose not to obey the command and obey God instead. But what they didn't do was go back to the Jerusalem church and say, hey, we need to rise up and fight with arms against the Jewish council and against the tyranny of Rome. Because again, what did their Lord say to Pilate? Acts 18 verse 36. He said, my kingdom is of this world? No, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from the world. That is very, very relevant. We should keep that in mind. Here's something else we should keep in mind. If you go back to the Peter passage, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17, you'll see that Peter commands Christians that they honor everyone. And even going so far at the end of verse 17 to honor the emperor. Again, Nero is who he was talking about. Extremely immoral, debauched, pagan, extremely wicked individual. And yet Christians were told by an apostle, I want you to honor that man. Now, why did he do that? Well, look at the context. Look at verse 15. Notice what he's associating honor, giving honor to governing authorities with. He told Christians in verse 17, give honor to the governing authorities. Look at verse 15. He's associating that with, quote, doing good so that you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Notice also, go back to Romans 13, verse 7. Paul, in context of talking about submitting to the governing authorities, he's talking about rulers. He's talking about governing authorities. He says, pay respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Remember, he's talking about governing authorities. He had just called those governing authorities God's servant, whom God himself had put into that position. Just like Peter. If you go back to Titus chapter 3, verse 2, verses 1 and 2, just like Peter did, what Paul does here in Titus 3, verses 1 and 2, in verse 2, he talks about speaking evil of no one and showing perfect courtesy towards all people. He's talking about that in the context of verse 1, where he's talking about rulers and authorities. Now, why am I bringing this up? The reason I'm bringing this up is because right now, many Christians are very politically minded, and there is a lot of dissatisfaction with the state of the government. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with the election. There's a lot of dissatisfaction about who is likely going to be in power in America next month. But this is not just now. I mean, for the past 20 years, I've observed a lot of Christians insult and dishonor governing authorities with whom they disagree politically, governing authorities whom they personally dislike. I have seen this done to rulers who personally are pretty immoral and pretty evil. I've also seen it done to rulers who personally were pretty decent people, but they just weren't liked because of their policies. And so what this is doing now is I am seeing some of my brothers and sisters in Christ, they're ignoring these passages that we've just read. And some of them are even trying to twist these passages that we've looked at tonight to say things that they don't actually say. I was recently told that in Romans 13, the governing authorities that we are told to submit to, well, those governing authorities, those are principles. That's the principle of government. These not specific individuals who are in power. That's what I was told. Well, that's wrong. That's not true, because Peter specifically spoke of the emperor and the governors under him in 1 Peter 2, verses 13 through 17, when he told Christians to submit to every human institution. In the Old Testament, Daniel chapter 2, look at verse 21. Daniel chapter 2, verse 21. Daniel says about God that God removes kings and sets up kings. Kings are not principles. Kings are specific individuals who are in power. Look at Daniel chapter 4, verse 25. Daniel's talking to a specific king, King Nebuchadnezzar here. And he is saying to this king that you need to know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. If you read that entire chapter, it's very clear that when Daniel says this, he has one specific ruler in mind. He has Nebuchadnezzar. In chapter 5 of Daniel, verse 21, when he's talking to Nebuchadnezzar's son about how God punished Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4, he tells Nebuchadnezzar's son, again, that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. He's not talking about an abstract principle here. He's talking about specific rulers who are individuals who are placed into power here. And so I find it no coincidence that the attempts of reimagining what these scriptures mean, that it's happening right now when a man who is very unpopular with a lot of Christians, myself included, is about to take power. Here's something else I've observed. Over recent weeks, I have seen several brothers in the church promote disobedience to the government, talk openly about revolution, talk openly about war, talk openly about secession. These mindsets, they go against what God has commanded us in the Bible that we looked at tonight. Remember, Paul and Peter, at the time they wrote to Christians to submit to the governing authorities, they were writing when a man was in power in Rome who was far more evil, far more tyrannical than anything that is currently seen in America today. I have seen some Christians who are very, very quick to quote the Declaration of Independence, but they never quote what the Bible teaches that we looked at tonight. And that's a problem. That's a problem. To focus on man-made documents and man-made philosophies, no matter how much we love them, to focus on that more than God's Word, that's a problem. I love the Declaration of Independence. I love the freedoms that we have in this country, which came about because of the Declaration of Independence. I'm an American. I'm a proud American. I don't like the direction that this country is headed in certain aspects. But, friends, as a Christian, my first allegiance must be to God. It must be to God's will that is revealed in the New Testament. I must seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, Matthew 6, verse 33. Because my first citizenship, my highest citizenship, is in the kingdom of Jesus Christ. He is my King and my Lord. Not only mine, but also He's the King and Lord of anyone who would bear the name of His Son, who would bear the name of Christian. And what He wishes is for all of His followers to honor rulers instead of insulting them and mocking them. It's fine that we disagree with a policy. It's fine that we understand if a policy is wicked, such as abortion or same-sex marriage. But we can express our disagreement of what a ruler does without insulting them and dishonoring them personally. That's what God's telling us to do here. He is also telling us, He's commanding us to submit to the governing authorities in all things, with there being only one exception again. That one exception being if those governing authorities directly tell us as Christians that we personally must what must violate what God has told us to do as revealed in Scripture. Christians, we need to follow all of God's commands. And that includes these commands here of submitting to the governing authorities and honoring them. And maybe the best way to do that is to set our minds more on the things above rather than the things on the earth, as Colossians 3 verses 1 and 2 says. Remember what Peter said. In the context of talking about honoring governing authorities and submitting to them, here's what he said in 1 Peter 2 verse 16. He told Christians, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Christians, we love our freedoms. Let's live as people who are free, but let's not use our freedom to sin. Instead, let's serve God. All right, let's move on to the next question. Let me bring it up here. Hold on one second. All right, the next question is also a deep one. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 10 says, for this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority over her head because of the angels. What symbol is being talked about here, and why is it because of the angels? Very, very good question. Let's go ahead and turn to 1 Corinthians. And again, when you want to know what a passage means, the first thing you got to do is look at the immediate context. So contextually, this verse is found right in the middle of a discussion that is found in verses 2 through 16 of chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians, and that in turn falls at the end of a long discourse that Paul gives to the Corinthian church about how they need to be willing to give up their personal freedoms in order to avoid being a stumbling block to others. You can read about that in chapters 8, 9, and 10 of 1 Corinthians. Now, let's also look at the historical context. Back in the first century AD, when this was written, the culture that Paul was living in, the culture that the Corinthians were living in, it was basically a kind of an unwritten rule in that culture that any respectable woman needed to wear a veil over their head if they went out in public. And it was a cultural sign of subjection to male authority. In fact, even today in a lot of Middle Eastern cultures today, it's a practice that is still observed. Now, in Paul's day, if you were a woman and you decided that you were going to go out in public with your heads uncovered, then the only women who did that back then were prostitutes. In fact, they were also known to go so far as to have their heads shaved. Now, let's look at 1 Corinthians 11. Let's look at the verses right before verse 10. Let's start with verse 2. Verse 2 of 1 Corinthians 11. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a woman, the head of the wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. In the Greek, wife and husband could also be translated woman and man. So what he is bringing out here is he's commending the Corinthian Christians for keeping the apostolic traditions he had given them, but verse 3, he still brings out that they need to understand God's arrangements concerning authority in the home and also authority in the church as well. Let's keep reading. Look again at verse 2. Verse 3 and verse 7. I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Look down at verse 7. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. Now, what he's bringing out here is, in the culture of that time, if a man covered his head, if a man wore a veil in public, then he would appear effeminate. He would, and thus be showing disrespect to his gender, disrespect to the role that God had appointed his gender to have, and therefore he would be showing disrespect to God. Now let's look at verses 5 and 6. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. And so basically, what he's saying here is, in that culture, a woman who chose to not wear a veil, to not have her head covered, or even going so far as to shave her head, that would show disrespect to her gender, to the role that God had appointed for her gender, and therefore it would show disrespect to God. So now we're getting closer to the passage in question. Look at verses 8 and 9. For man is not from woman, but woman from man. Nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. So what he's bringing out here is that that woman was made from man and was created for the man. We saw that earlier when we read Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. God saw with Adam that it is good for the man not to be alone. Then verses 18 through 23 caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, surgically removed one of Adam's ribs, formed woman from that man, from the rib of the man, as a helper for Adam. So that's very true that woman was made from man, was created for the man. Now, in that culture, respect for that male authority was shown by women wearing a covering over their head when they are in public. So that brings us to verse 10. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head. What reason? Verses 8 and 9. Woman is from the man. Woman was created for the man. Male authority is what he's talking about here. And so, for that reason, for the male authority, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority over her head. In other words, wear the head covering, wear the veil. What that head covering symbolized in that culture was that respect for male authority. So that leads us to the next question. Well, who are the angels? Because verse 10 says, for this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Okay, who are the angels and what do angels have to do with this? Now, when you think of angels, you're probably thinking of celestial beings, right? Of course you are. But the word angel itself, angelos in the Greek, the word itself literally means messengers. Now, most of the time when this Greek term is used in the Bible, it does refer to celestial, non-human messengers who are from God. For example, in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, we see that it was a celestial messenger, a celestial angel that appeared to Mary and gave her the message from God that she would be with child, of course, that being Jesus. It was celestial messengers that appeared to the shepherds as well. But there are also times when this same Greek term is used to refer to human messengers, refer to Christians who preach God's message to the world. For example, the 7 churches in Asia that Revelation was written to. If you read chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation, when each one of those churches received its own unique message, it always started out with, to the angel at the church of Ephesus, write this. To the angel of the church of Philadelphia, write this. To the angel of the church of Thyatira, write this. Angel means messenger. So what literally he was saying is to the messenger of the church at Ephesus, to the messenger of the church at Thyatira, to the messenger of the church of Laodicea. And so angels mean messengers. Most of the time they're celestial, but it could also refer to human messengers, basically people who are giving God's message to the world. That's probably what the angels are referring to here in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 10. Remember, the mission of the church at Corinth was to preach the gospel to the whole world. Mark 16:15, go into all the world and preach the gospel to the whole creation. And Paul had just told them in chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians, verses 31 through 33, he told them, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. So he was telling them that you need to preach the gospel. You need to give people God's message, and you need to do so in a way that would avoid offending anyone, that would, in ways that would keep them from being receptive to the gospel message. So that's what he had just finished telling them. And so now in that same context, he is telling these Corinthian sisters in Christ, who apparently were violating cultural norms by going around in public with their heads uncovered. What he is basically saying is, you ought to go ahead and abide by these societal norms and wear that symbol of authority on your head. And the reason you should do this is because of the angels, literally because of the messengers. In other words, he is saying to them, hey, stop flouting the cultural norms, stop offending people by having your heads uncovered, because what that's doing is making them not receptive to the message of the gospel, which our messengers, the preachers out there, are preaching to them. That's the point that he's making in chapter 11, verse 10. So let's move on to the next question. In Luke chapter 6, how is it not a sin that Jesus picks grain on the Sabbath? Luke chapter 6, how is it not a sin that Jesus picks grain on the Sabbath? Now, the episode that is in question here is found in Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. It's also found, the same episode has parallel accounts in Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, and Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through 28. Let's go ahead and read the Luke account. Luke chapter 6, we're going to read verses 1 through 5. On a Sabbath, while he was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those with him? And he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." So you have Jesus and his disciples. They're walking through a grain field. His disciples are hungry, and they begin to pick the heads of grain, and Luke brings out that they were rubbing them in their hands to remove the husks, and then they would eat the raw grain. The Pharisees come along, they see this happening, and they accuse his disciples of breaking the Sabbath laws about labor. So apparently to the Pharisees, just simply picking a few heads of grain would be the same as harvesting the entire field, pretty much. Jesus defends his disciples with several arguments here. Luke brings out a couple of them. If you go to Matthew's account and Mark's account, you'll see others as well. First of all, if you look at Luke chapter 6, verses 3 and 4, Jesus points out to the Pharisees that in the Old Testament, David had eaten of the sacred bread in the tabernacle when he was hungry, and apparently the Pharisees are not condemning David for doing that. So if they're not going to condemn David for doing that, why are they condemning Jesus' disciples? If you go to Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 12, verse 5, he also brings out to the Pharisees that the priests work on the Sabbath, and they're not condemned for working on the Sabbath. If you go to Mark's account, Mark chapter 2, verse 27, he brings out a pretty significant point here. He says that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. In other words, God intended the Sabbath to be a blessing for man, not a burden for man. So to tell these hungry disciples that they couldn't even do something as insignificant as pick a head of grain off of a stalk to eat it when they're hungry, that was not the rest from labor that God had in mind for the Sabbath under Old Testament law. And what Jesus also points out, if you go back to Matthew's account, look at Matthew chapter 12, verse 7, Jesus in that verse, he cites Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, "I desire compassion and not a sacrifice." And the reason he cites that is because the point he's making is that God places more importance on relieving suffering and helping people who are in need, including hungry people, than he does on fulfilling rituals, especially man-made rituals like the Pharisees' laws about the Sabbath. Not only that, if you go back to Luke chapter 6, verse 5, what Jesus says is the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, and that's true. Jesus is the Son of God. He's the Messiah. He's deity himself. He outranked their human traditions. Matthew chapter 12, verse 6, he brings out that he implies that he outranks their temple. And then here in Luke's account, by saying the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, he outranks the Sabbath himself. In other words, if anyone had the authority to determine what could be done and what could not be done within the framework of the Old Testament laws concerning the Sabbath day, that would be Jesus. And so we see that Jesus is defending his disciples' actions here. By defending them, he is condoning them. And so it is clear that as far as Jesus is concerned, no sin was taking place. To sin is to violate the laws of God. Jesus is God. He apparently thought that there was no law being violated here. So that is how it is not a sin that Jesus' disciples pick grain on the Sabbath. Let's go to the next question. Is there an example of a child being disciplined physically in the Bible? If not, how have we deduced that spare the rod implies hitting a child with a rod? Now the sentence spare the rod and spoil the child, that's what came to my mind. Many people think that's in the Bible. That's actually not in the Bible. Spare the rod and spoil the child is not in the Bible. The phrase spare the rod and spoil the child, it actually comes from a poem that was written in the 1600s, and that poem, it's called Hudibras by Samuel Butler. That poem has nothing to do with children. It is a poem that's about fornication, basically. So spare the rod and spoil the child is not found in the Bible. But with that said, the concept of corporal punishment of children, aka spanking, that is found in Scripture. Now, the question asked, is there an example of a child being disciplined physically in the Bible? Now, I was unable to find any examples where you can read in the Bible of an episode where a parent spanks a child. But there are a lot of biblical principles connected with spanking. For example, in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 7, the rhetorical question is asked, for what son is there whom his father does not discipline? Verse 9 of Hebrews 12, the writer goes on to say, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us and we respected them. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, Christian fathers are commanded, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Now, if the book of Ephesians was written, the only guidance that Christians would have about what the discipline of the Lord consisted of would be found in the Old Testament. So with that in mind, let's go to the Old Testament, consider some of the following passages from Proverbs. For example, Proverbs 13, verse 24. Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. Proverbs 22, verse 15. Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him. Proverbs 23, verses 13 and 14. Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die. If you strike him with the rod, you will save his soul from Sheol, Sheol being the grave in Hebrew. Proverbs 29, verse 15. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. And then verse 17 of Proverbs 29, discipline your son and he will give you rest. He will give delight to your heart. So it's clear that spanking a child, even though that's kind of unpopular with a lot of people in our society today, it is a biblical concept. Now, with that said, it must also be pointed out that spanking a child can be done in the wrong way. In fact, the scriptures imply this. It says in Ephesians, again, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. When you discipline a child through corporal punishment and you do it in an unfair way, you do it in a tyrannical way, You injure them, you extremely hurt them, and outside of the time of discipline, you show them no love, no kindness, whether they're good or bad. That's exactly what's going to provoke them to anger, which is exactly what God told us as parents not to do. Uh, Now, obviously, here's something else to keep in mind. You go back up to the Proverbs passage, Proverbs chapter 23, verses 13 through 14. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die. Obviously, there is a point where if you strike someone with a rod, you could, in fact, kill them. The fact that God is saying if you strike him with a rod, he will not die, what that indicates is that God does not want the corporal punishment of a child to actually damage the child in any way. Instead, what we are gathering from these verses here is that the sting of spanking, not only the sting of spanking, but also you take that and combine it with other kinds of disciplinary action that might fit the occasion, and then you especially combine it with showing that child love and kindness and empathy and fun when they are being good. What that does is it's going to produce in that child wisdom instead of foolishness. It's going to produce in that child a motivation and a desire to do what is right and respect authority instead of doing what is wrong. And these types of characteristics, when you teach them to children and when you reinforce them through this kind of discipline starting early and going throughout their childhood, that's going to result in good lives for them as adults, and happiness and pride and peace for you as parents. So let's go to the very last question of the evening. Jesus said to turn the other cheek. Does this mean Christians are not ever to defend themselves? Jesus said to turn the other cheek. Does this mean that Christians are not ever to defend themselves? Now, in the context, Jesus was correcting the misinterpretation of several Old Testament passages. Exodus chapter 21, verse 24, Leviticus chapter 24, verse 20, Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 21. All of those passages are where you read the phrase eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And the way that the scribes and the Pharisees of that time were teaching the Jews about these passages, they were saying that eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth was basically God giving you permission to seek personal vengeance. But Jesus was correcting that. Let's go to Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount, and let's read verses starting with verse 38. Matthew 5, starting with verse 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Now, the scribes and the Pharisees were teaching that the phrase eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, that was basically God giving them permission to seek revenge if someone had wronged them. But in reality, these Old Testament passages that said eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, the Exodus passage, the Leviticus passage, the Deuteronomy passage, you read the context of those passages, what they were actually doing was, though the phrase eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, were directives to the governing authorities who were responsible for official judgments concerning proven criminal wrongdoing and criminal activity. In fact, the purpose behind these statements in the Old Testament was to limit the punishment that was being given for the crime, limiting it to what would be appropriate and instead of unfair. Promoting personal vengeance against wrongs that was done to someone by someone else, that was not what these passages were meant to teach when the Old Testament says eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And so what Jesus is doing here in the Sermon on the Mount is he is correcting that error. He's teaching his followers to not seek personal vengeance for the wrongs that were done for them. Instead, look at verse 39. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, and slapping someone on the right cheek was a common form of insulting someone back then. So if someone slaps you on the right cheek and insults you by doing that, they've done you wrong in that way. Don't retaliate by doing the same thing back to them. Instead, turn the other cheek. Verse 40, if someone is unjustly suing you for your tunic, then give them more than they're wanting. Let them have your cloak as well. Look at verse 41. If you're a Jew back then and a Roman soldier exercises his tyrannical legal right to force you to stop what you're doing and to carry his belongings for him for 1 mile, and Jesus says, wrong's being done to you, instead of retaliating and trying to get vengeance, go with him 1 more mile, go with him 2 miles. So basically, the point that Jesus is making here is someone does wrong to you, don't try to retaliate and seek vengeance, and don't have the mindset of, oh, you're taking my eye, well, I'm going to take your eye out of vengeance. You're going to take my tooth, I'm going to take your tooth because I want revenge. Instead, have the mindset which is promoted in the command, do not resist the one who is evil, in verse 39. In other words, show them love instead. Now, does this mean that self-defense is something that God would condemn as sin? Not necessarily, for several reasons. Number one, total non-resistance to evil would only encourage even more evil. It would only encourage more wrongdoing. Not only that, but Acts chapter 23, verses 12 through 31, Acts 23, verses 12 through 31, you will see Paul basically seeking to defend himself against people who were trying to kill him. He wasn't passively offering no resistance to their efforts to murder him. Instead, he was calling the guard to come and protect him, and which would mean basically that if he was attacked while he was under guard, then those guards would hurt or even kill his attackers. And Paul knew that, but he was seeking that self-defense anyway. And Luke chapter 22, verses 36 through 38, you'll read on one occasion where Jesus encouraged his disciples to buy swords. Now, swords are weapons. Weapons are designed to wound someone or kill them. Now, Jesus certainly would not want his disciples to use these swords for aggressive violence. He certainly would not want his disciples to use these swords for personal vengeance. So what's the only reason left as to why he would condone or even command them to purchase swords? And that is self-defense. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8, it says, if anyone does not provide for his own and for members of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So Christians are told to provide for their families, and certainly protection would be included in what they are to provide for their loved ones. The point being, there is a difference between self-defense, defending yourself, and you're doing it out of desire to protect yourself and to protect your loved ones. There's a difference between that and doing harm to someone else out of hate or out of a desire for retribution, a desire for vengeance. So when Jesus says to turn the other cheek, in the context, he was condemning hurting someone out of hate or vengeance. He was not condemning self-defense. All right, that is it for all of our questions. The last Q&A of 2020. Lord willing, we will have this again in January, so make sure if you have questions, if you have follow-up questions to what you've heard tonight, if you have questions of a different nature that are biblical, then by all means, submit them. You can reach me at calhounchurchofchrist@gmail.com. Give me those questions, and we'll see about having them on for next month's Q&A. The written answers will be on our website not too long from now, as well as the video, this video. It's going to be on our YouTube channel as well, and it's currently being live streamed to Facebook. So thank you for watching. I hope all of you all have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. God bless.